Hello, my student, and here is Unit 3 about the clause. Okay, the first unit we've discussed about a part of speech, and the previous unit we've discussed about the phrase, and you have learned about many types of the phrases. And here is about the clause. That will be another level of the language. Let's see. What is a clause? Can you guess? Well, a clause is a group of related words. And here is the point. We have both subject and verb in a clause, but there is some difference between each type of the clause, okay? And there are two different types of clauses that can be used to develop the sentences. So primarily, we have to say that the clause can be differentiated or divided into two ways. The first one, it's called independent clause. Independent. So from its name, you can see that it's independent. It means that they can stand alone, right? Or another way, we can say that they are main clauses. Okay, main clause. Number two, that is dependent clause. When something is dependent, so it means that it cannot stand alone. They must be used, they must be attached with something else, right? And what it's called for the dependent clause, it can be divided into subordinate clause and relative clause. So it means that once that you are using the subordinate clause or relative clause, they must be used with the main clause to make it into a complete sentence. Okay, so we can say that the main clause, there will be only one type. It's their main clause with a complete thought. But for subordinate clause or relative clause or dependent clause can be divided into like different ways. Let's start with the first one, independent clause or the main clause. As I mentioned that this type of the clause can stand alone. So another way, some of the people can claim this type of the clause as a simple sentence. That's because we have the subject and the verb with the complete thought. We can understand this type of the clause clearly without any doubt. Okay? Although independent clauses can stand alone, but they can be used by joining with other clauses to make more complex sentences. If we mention about the type of the sentence, there will be several types of the sentence, like the simple, compound, complex, and even compound complex sentence. So if you use the independent clause alone or main clause alone, that will be just a simple sentence. But if you want to add more information by adding some kind of complicated structure, that's gonna be complex sentence, and that's what we are going to do with the main clause. You are going to attach something with this kind of the clause. So two or more independent clauses can be joined by using coordinating conjunction. Oh, what is coordinating conjunction? Fanboys, right? So if you are having two independent clauses and you want to join them together, you need coordinating conjunctions. Okay, and here is the pattern of the main clause or of independent clause. What you need is subject and verb. So can you remember SVO structure that I mentioned like very long time ago? But to be a basic sentence, we need S and V, and that is subject and verb. And don't forget that that subject and verb needs to give you a complete thought, a complete idea, that you don't need to ask for even more information. Okay, that is the basic pattern for independent clause or main clause. Here is the examples. Erica brushed her long black hair. Erica is the subject, brushed as the verb. okay? But in this sentence, we have some direct objects. That is her long black hair, and that is a complete sentence because you can understand that Erica brushed her long black hair very clearly, right? Fernando left and Erica brushed her long black hair. So in this sentence, we have two clauses. The first clause, Fernando left. We have Fernando as the subject and left as the verb. And another clause on the right, Erica as the subject, brushed as the verb. So we are joining these two clauses together by using coordinating conjunction and. So that is possible. But what about the last one? After she told Fernando to leave, I have to say that the first clause is not independent clause because we are using something else, and that you can see we are using the word after. The word after here in this sentence, in this clause, this is subordinating conjunction, so we won't talk about that right now. But Erica brushed her long black hair is still independent clause. So don't forget that if it is the independent clause, it will start with subject and then followed by the verb, or probably with some kind of modifier, some kind of objects. Okay, here is the independent clause or the main clause. Alright, now let's move on to the dependent clause, or we have another name that is subordinate clause and relative clause. But how are they different? Let's start with the definition for dependent clause. When we're talking about a dependent clause, we need to think about that they cannot stand alone. And it's different from independent, right? Because if it is independent clause, they can stand alone as a complete thought. But here for dependent clause, we need something else to be attached with in order to make it complete, okay? And for dependent clauses, they can be easily recognized. That's because it starts with what is called subordinating conjunction. So can you still remember about conjunction? We have three types of conjunctions, right? The first one, coordinating conjunction, those stuff like fanboys. And we have subordinating conjunction. And the last one, correlative conjunctions. But here I'm mentioning about subordinating conjunction, like the word because, whereas, as, while, after, before. I mean that if we use the subordinating conjunction to introduce the clause, that clause will be called subordinate clause. Okay. But if that clause is introduced by relative pronoun, relative adjective, or even relative adverb, they would be called relative clause. So it means that the difference between subordinate clause or relative clause, I can say that both of them, they are dependent clause, but it depends on what you are using to introduce the clause. If you are using the subordinating conjunction, that clause will be called subordinate clause. But if you introduce that clause by using relative stops, that's gonna be relative clause. Okay? And here is the pattern for each type of the clause. If it is subordinating conjunction to introduce the clause to be called subordinate clause, and that will be followed by the subject and verb. But if it's for the relative clause, it's possible that after those relative pronoun, adjective, or even adverb, it will be followed by the subject and the verb. But another possibility is that we can use relative pronoun, relative adjective, or even relative adverb in order to be the subject of that clause. So in that case, we're gonna use just the verb right after this kind of introduction. Okay, I will give you some examples here. The first one, after, you can see in purple, right? After she told Fernando to leave, comma, Erica brushed her long black hair. So in this sentence, we have two clauses. Erica brushed her long black hair, that is the main clause, that is a complete thought. But for after she told Fernando to leave, that is dependent clause. starting with the word after. The word after is subordinating conjunction. So after she told Fernando to leave, that is subordinate clause. Okay, that is subordinate clause. And you can see that we have subordinating conjunction after, and then we use the subject she and then verb and like the normal structure of the sentence. Okay, what about the next one? Erica brushed her long black hair while she waited for Fernando to leave. The first one, Erica brushed her long black hair, that is main clause, right? And then we are using the word while, that is subordinating conjunction, to introduce this clause. So while she waited for Fernando to leave, this is subordinate clause. That's right. Okay, so the first two sentences we are using the word after and the word while. So I just mark it in purple. They are subordinate clause. Okay, because we are using subordinating conjunction. Next one, Joseph ran to get paper towels for the cola that had spilled over the glass and splashed onto the counter. Here we are using the word that in order to introduce the relative clause, and we are using the pattern of relative pronoun, and we use this relative pronoun as the subject. That's why we can use the verb just to follow this relative pronoun. Okay, next one, the lazy students whom Mrs. Russell hit in the head with a chalk eraser soon learn to keep their complaints to themselves. So for this one, we use the word whom to introduce this clause. So this is the relative clause. I mark for both relative in green. Okay. So here we are using the word whom and then followed by the subject, Mrs. Russell, and then followed by the verb. Okay. Next, I will explain about the different types of dependent clauses. So you can see that when we're talking about independent clause, it's equal to simple sentence. So there is no subtypes for independent. But for dependent clauses, it can be divided into three ways. Okay, can be identified into three types. The first one, that is noun clause. The second one, adjective clause. And the last one is adverb clause. We don't have something else. Okay, so don't try to make use of something else like verb clause. What about preposition clause, interjection clause? We don't have that. Okay, only three of them. Okay, let's start with the first type of the clause, that is the noun clause. You can see that noun clause is one type of a dependent clause, and we normally use them as the subject of the sentence, or it can be a direct or even indirect object of the sentence. It can also be a subject complement or even an object of the preposition. And I made this table in order to make sure that everyone understand how are they different between the noun phrase and the noun clause. Okay, you can see on the leftmost we have many functions that both noun phrase and noun clause can act. They can be the subject, direct or indirect object, subject complement, or even object of the preposition. Let's start with the first one, the subject. For noun phrase, you can see the example of his whereabouts are unknown. Okay, so his whereabouts, that is the noun phrase, because the word whereabouts can be the head word of this phrase, and we use the word his as the possessive adjective to modify the word whereabouts. While the noun clause, we can say where he lives is unknown. Okay, where he lives, we are using the word where to introduce the clause. Okay, and it's used as the subject of this sentence. How do you know that this is the subject of the sentence? You can see from the position, because it appears before the verb. Okay, because we have the word is as the main verb of this sentence. So that is the first function for the noun clause, right? That it can be the subject of the sentence. Next is direct object. I don't know that man. Now let's see the first one. I don't know that man. That man, that is the object of the verb know. Man, that is the head word. And the word that is demonstrative adjective to modify the word man. I don't know who he is. That is for the noun clause, okay? And you won't see like the noun, but it starts with some kind of connector, some kind of relative pronoun, right? Who he is, but it's used as the object of this sentence. Next, the security officer gave the students the key. We have two objects in this sentence, right? The students, that is indirect object, and the key, that is direct object. Let's talk about the students. Students, we have the word students as the head word, and that is definite article, or it's one kind of adjective to modify the word students, okay? And for the noun clause, we have the security officers gave whoever wanted it the key. Okay, exactly the same meaning, okay? But we don't mentioning that it should be the students, but there must be some person that wanted the key, okay? So who wanted it? That is the noun clause to be used as indirect object in this sentence. Okay, and here I just add another information about subject complement, because we also use the noun clause as the subject complement. But let's see for the noun phrase first. Charlie's problem was his laziness. Okay, the word laziness is the head word of this phrase, and we just add the word his, that is possessive adjective to modify the word laziness, right? But in number 3, for the noun clause, Charlie's problem was that he didn't practice enough. We use the word that to introduce the clause, and here you can see that we just use it as the subject complement. It's not the object, because we have Charlie's problem and was, that is the linking verb, and as I told you that after the linking verb, it's not the position of the object, but that's the position for subject complement. That's right, because Charlie's problem and that he didn't practice enough, or even his laziness, they are equal, okay? And the last one, object of the preposition. The first one for the noun phrase, he isn't interested in geometry. Okay, geometry, that is the noun phrase, because only one word can be the noun phrase, right? But for noun clause, what we have here, he isn't interested in what the class is studying. Okay, hopefully that's not my class, please. Okay, so in what the class is studying, here this is the object of the preposition in. Okay, so you can see that there are many functions that the noun clause can act. I can say that noun, noun phrase, and even noun clause, all of them act with the same functions. Okay, and here are some connectors that are commonly found for the noun clause. Okay, what do we have here? We have like the word how, that, when, where, whether, if, why, what, whatever, who, whomever, whose, whichever. Okay, but the thing is, I don't recommend you to just memorize by each word. Sometimes you may find these words in another way of using. So my advice is try to think about the function in the sentence. Okay, try to think about the function in the sentence, not stick with the form. Okay, don't think too much about the form, because this is just the common thing that happen, but it's also there may be some kind of exception, there may be some kind of like other usage that is also possible. Okay, so think about the function better. All right, anyway, I give you more examples. The laboratory aide reported that all the students had completed the experiment. So the laboratory aide reported, and after that, that is the position of the object. Okay, reported what, and that is the position of the object. So we can use the noun clause as the object, as I mentioned. The students asked when the psychology reports were due, the same, right? Or Mrs. Peterson asked whether the secretaries had ordered the office supplies yet. So all of this, they are the examples of how we use the noun clause as the direct object in the sentence. Reported what, asked what, okay? So we just use them in order to be the direct object of the sentence. Next is adjective clause. So once again, you can see that adjective clause is a dependent clause, and we are using them in order to modify a noun or a pronoun. So adjective phrase, and adjective clause, we are using them to modify the noun. So the same function, okay? And here are some common connectors that can be found with the adjective clause, right? Like the word who, whom, which, that, when, where, and why. And the thing is, I don't want you to just memorize all of these words. Just think about the function that happened, that like is a real usage in that sentence, okay? Think about the function that is used in that sentence better. Don't stick with the form, okay? Don't stick with the form. And here are some examples that you can use the adjective clause in the sentence. The first one, David in red, okay, who has been with the company for 5 years, is our new director. So actually for the main clause is only David is our new director. But if you want to give more information about Mr. David, so you just add the adjective clause, who has been with the company for 5 years. So this adjective clause is used to modify the noun David. David is the noun, right? It's a proper noun, okay? Next one, the time when our plane arrives is 4 p.m. The main clause is only the time is 4 p.m. But we are using the adjective clause when our plane arrives to modify the time, and that is the noun, okay? The house where Lincoln lived as a young man was in Springfield, Illinois. So we are using where Lincoln lived as a young man to modify the house, okay? And the last one, the diamond ring which the thief stole was worth $1 million. So which the thief stole, that is to give more information or to describe the noun ring, okay? So you can see that when we are using the adjective clause, definitely it will be placed right after the noun that is used to modify, okay? David, and then adjective clause, the time, the house, and diamond ring, and then adjective clause right after the word that you want to modify. Okay, this is the way that you can use the adjective clause. And here is the last one, adverb clause. Adverb clause is a dependent clause, as you know, and we use them in order to modify verb, adjectives, another verb, or even a sentence. So you can see that adverb, adverb phrase, and adverb clause, we are using them with the same functions. That is to modify verb, adjective, adverb, and this is like plus a sentence for adverb clause, alright? And they normally begins with some kind of subordinator. So for this one, it's worth to remember that they normally start with subordinating conjunctions, okay? The subordinator is a connecting word which explains the relationship between adverb clause and main clause, okay? We normally see these subordinating conjunction like the word after, although, as if, because, before, even if, even though, unless, as soon as, whatever, whenever, wherever, while, okay? Alright, so let's see the examples in the sentence, how we can use the adverb clause in the sentence. The first one, Cinderella lost her shoe after the clock. Cinderella lost her shoe after the clock struck 12. So in this sentence, you see that after the clock struck 12 is used to modify the word lost, right? To modify the word lost. Mary hid the key where no one could find it. where no one could find it, that is to modify the word hid. Next is my sister drove so fast that she got a ticket. A ticket in this sentence is not a ticket for a concert, but it's ticket that you probably get from the police if you just break the rules, the traffic rules, okay? And another one, we can swim in the pool as soon as you put on sunscreen. This is to modify swim, right? Can swim as soon as you put on sunscreen. The fire will burn the forest unless it rains. What does it mean, unless? Unless means if not. The fire will burn the forest if it doesn't rain. Okay, so you can see that for three types of the clauses, noun clause, adjective clause, and adverb clause, we are using them differently. How? Okay, once again, if we are talking about the noun clause, that will be exactly the same function as the noun, right? So we use the noun clause to be the subject, object, subject complement, or even object of the preposition. So you need to find these in the sentence, whether they fall into one of these functions or not. Okay. Next is for the adjective clause. I can say that adjective clause is really simple, the simplest type that we can find, okay, that you can identify, because we just use adjective clause to modify the noun that is before that clause, okay, just to modify the noun right before that clause, not something else. And for the adverb clause, we're using some kind of subordinating conjunction that is to introduce the clause, and that clause is used to modify verb, probably adverb, in the sentence or even like the whole sentence. So think about the function that you are using or the function of the clause that has been used with a particular sentence, okay? Don't stick with some word. Don't stick with like, oh, I can remember that this word belongs to this, belongs to that. I don't recommend you to think like that, okay? Think about the function, the real use in the sentence, all right? So this is the last part of the unit 3 that is about the clause. Still, we have the last unit to go. That is about the sentence. We have a lot more information about the sentence that you have to know as we are studying syntax, the sentence structure. Alright, see you again in the next video. Bye!